Has it got caffeine or not? This is really to delve into some of those decaffeinated brands of tea out there and to see how much caffeine there is in them. We're going to do this in a relative comparison to some other teas. This ties into a video I previously created on how we analyze the caffeine molecule using mass spec, specifically using time of flight in an accurate mass workflow. So for this simple comparison with teas, how much caffeine is in these teas, we've got our English breakfast decaffeinated version. I'm going to compare this to the Earl Grey, to green tea, as well as a Yorkshire tea. And I've made 4 cups of tea using standard tap water, boiled that in a kettle, and then allowed these tea bags to brew in the cups for about 5 minutes. I took 1 milliliter aliquots of each of these teas, placed them into my autosampler vials. I did make a further dilution of 1 in 10 as at these concentrations the caffeine was quite strong, so we needed to do a little bit of dilution, as you will see from the results. I also used my boiled water as a standard control, and you will see that. So in total we've got 5 samples: the blank, the Yorkshire, the green tea, the Earl Grey tea, and the English breakfast tea, which we then submit on our mass spectrometer. I wanted to show you how simple it is to actually submit these samples on the method we created. I'm using the walk-up interface, which is a skin which goes over your standard acquisition, and we'll very simply submit our samples with some of our optimized methods. So we will go submit samples, and I've created a new user account called Tea Enthusiast. It's got a specific password. I've got my 5 samples, and here I can select my different vial types. I can select plates, 96 well plates, or I can also submit with our standard 2 ml vials. I'm going to select the walk-up method, and in this case it's the T profiling method, quite a standard generic method for our time of flight system, but we will focus in on that formula for caffeine, C8H10N4O2. As I have copy down, that's easy enough to fill in. I can also decide on the injection volume, the UV wavelength, and give it a description so I can return to the sample again. So I have my blank, my Yorkshire, my green, Earl Grey, and my English breakfast, which is the decaf. Great. So samples are given specific names, the formula we're interested in. Of course, here we can add multiple formula, so separated by a comma. So if you're not only interested in caffeine, maybe some of the flavonoids or some of the tannins, gallic acid, then you can also add those formula. We click next. It allocates a position in the autosampler for us. I've placed these vials in already, and we can just hit finish, and the system will take care of the rest. It's queued up the samples. You'll see that the system is intelligent enough to start conditioning the column, heat up the mass spec components, and we will return to look at the PDF reports. Okay, so my system has generated some automated reports from that analysis, and essentially what it's doing is taking that formula for caffeine. It's looking in this sample purity analysis at both the mass spec and the UV 280 nanometer signal and seeing if it can find anything. So first, for all comparisons, we have a blank. We can see that there's no mass spec peak. So where's it looking for the mass spec? It's looking for that protonated and sodiated ion of caffeine, and we can't see any peaks there. And here's our UV chromatogram. It has kind of a peak in the back end, but overall you'll see that this is essentially blank signal coming from our UV with very low counts. So that's a confirmation in that there's no caffeine detected in the blank. That's always a good control. Let's have a look at the Yorkshire sample. So in this case, we can see a mass spec peak. It's quite a strong peak here. We're getting tens of millions of counts with abundance values, and we also get a purity value. How pure is this relative to some of the other peaks in the UV chromatogram? There's been a correlation between the UV and the mass spec. So just to confirm, we are detecting the caffeine molecule as a protonated as well as a slight sodiated abundance. So some of the ions monoisotopic masses are there. We can see that there's a ppm mass error of 5.5, which is enough for confirmation. Of course, you would need a standard to ultimately confirm this, but we've run standards on the system, and we know that's typically within the mass error ranges of the system. So we can see some intensities of the different isotopologues, carbon-13 isotopes, and so forth. And then we can see the UV 280 nanometer spectra or chromatogram, which we can see there's the caffeine peak, but there are a few other peaks in there, other flavonoids, other molecules that also absorb UV wavelength at 280 nanometers. What has been done is there's been a correlation, so the mass spec peak has been correlated to the UV peak, and in this case there's our compound 1, which is caffeine, and we can get a peak area out of that. So for the Yorkshire tea sample we've got 137, and we can then compare these peak areas relative to all the other samples and get a feeling for how much caffeine is really in our samples. If we look at the green tea, similar story, we've confirmed with a mass spec peak, so we know the mass spec peak is at 1.9. Again, we've got similar isotope uh, ion charge carriers, that is the protonated and the sodiated. Have a look, the green tea is quite an interesting sample. So here's our caffeine peak, we see 2 additional peaks there, and that's then of course very interesting, which we can delve into. And now we've got accurate mass, we can actually look at the masses under these later on and figure out what the formula are, and so quite an interesting sample. If we look at the Earl Grey tea, which is then slightly more fermented, again we've got mass spec abundance values, so how big is this mass spec peak? Again, confirmation of the different charge carriers, and we've got our UV peak here, 2 smaller ones compared to that green tea one. Here's our decaffeinated sample, and you will see that even in the mass spec we can see something. Um, the, the, we can see at least confirmation of the charge carrier. So in the mass spec that signal is fairly low compared to the other samples, about a tenth. And let's have a look at the UV data. So the UV data, you notice, is much different, and here we have to be careful. That's the limitation of working with UV data only, is how do I know now which peak is really the right one to integrate, especially if there's so many of them. So we can only go on retention times with UV, and we will stick to that 1.94 minutes, and that's the peak area we're getting. So we're getting the peak area around there. So I've put all this data into a graph to show you how we can do relative quantitations. Looking at the peak areas, and I've put it in a easy to visualize graph. For the blank, we didn't see any peak areas at 280 nanometers for that peak at 1.94 minutes. Then for the Yorkshire tea, we had about 138, and the green tea values I've put in. So because this is a relative comparison, the values don't really matter too much. We just wanted to see what is the English breakfast decaffeinated version relative to the Yorkshire. And here we can see it's about 10% of the caffeine peak area. If we do a similar comparison for the mass spec peak, so we're using this extracted ion chromatogram, we're looking at that protonated and sodiated adducts, we're then looking at that peak area of that response. Here we can see a slightly different result of 18% relative to the Yorkshire tea, and there are some differences. So overall, the English breakfast decaffeinated version is about 10 times less caffeine than conventional Yorkshire tea. So, has it got caffeine or not? Yes, it has got caffeine in it, just at somewhat lower concentrations. Of course, this study could be translated and made much more powerful by doing more sampling. We've only had one sample point, one analysis. You could do triplicates, biological replicates. You could look at other brands of tea. Um, and of course, we're doing relative comparisons here. We could do a calibration curve where we have a caffeine standard. We can make sure about that retention time, at least in the UV. We can do what they call matrix matched calibration, so we can take some tea and we can put caffeine inside, so we make sure the background is the same when we're doing comparisons, because in mass spec we can run into issues with differences in ionization, where you get an enhancement or a reduction effect by the matrix, by some of the other components in the background. And we have to make sure that we don't fall into this trap of getting the influence of these other molecules on our quantitation. Of course, if you want to make this even more accurate, you can get hold of a standard, the caffeine standard, which is then isotopically labeled, the heavy labeled version of it, so where we've got either the carbons or the nitrogens labeled, and we can then also fortify that into the samples and look at the recovery of that, and that would also improve the mass spec type of analysis. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and just to give you a little bit of a flavor for how we would just look at a particular molecule, caffeine in tea. And please leave your comments and suggestions, and tell me what you like to see and what you like analyzing in the lab.